It is the late 1990s in Vancouver's downtown Eastside. A woman doesn't show up for a coffee date. Another woman misses a check-in with her sister. A mother waits by a payphone that used to ring every week, and then it just doesn't. Some of the missing people are Indigenous. Most are poor. Many are sex workers, drug users, women in the city used to stepping around. Their friends start to notice patterns. Their families report them missing. They show up at police stations, at front desks, at press conferences, asking the same question over and over. Where is my daughter? Where is my sister? Where is my friend? For years, the answer they get back is a shrug wrapped around polite words. They're probably traveling. She will turn up. She is living a high-risk lifestyle. Meanwhile, just across the river in Port Coquitlam, a pig farm is quietly becoming a crime scene on a scale this country has never seen. This is the Pickton case, missing woman, systemic failure. I am Nazif Mahbub. Welcome to another episode of the Haunted Action podcast.
The Haunted Action podcast contains mature themes, including references to real-world crime and disturbing events. It is intended for adult audiences. While non-graphic, some listeners may find the content distressing. Please listen with care, pause if you need to, and use headphones around others. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to Haunted Action, where true crime meets the things we can't quite explain. Every week, we step into the dark corners of real events, unsolved mysteries, chilling murders, and supernatural haunted stories. Some of what you'll hear is documented fact. Some comes from eyewitness accounts, folklore, and local legends. You decide what you believe. This is not a show for the faint of heart. We talk about violence, death, and fear, and sometimes the monsters are human. Sometimes we're not so sure. So lock your doors, dim the lights, and if you're listening alone, maybe don't. Welcome to Haunted Action. Listen to all episodes at hauntedaction.com.
This is the story of Robert Pickton and the missing woman of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. It's a case that exposed deep failures of our justice system and the vulnerability of marginalized communities. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that this episode discusses violence against women, particularly Indigenous women and women struggling with addiction. The content may be difficult for some listeners. To understand this case, we need to go back to Vancouver's downtown Eastside in the 1990s. This neighborhood, just blocks from the city's gleaming downtown core, was the remains of one of Canada's poorest postal codes. The area was gripped by poverty, addiction, and survival sex work. Women walked these streets every day, trying to survive in circumstances most of us cannot imagine. The downtown Eastside had become a perfect storm of social and economic failure. By the mid-1990s, something terrible was happening. women were disappearing from the downtown Eastside at an alarming rate. These were runaways or people who simply moved away. These were women with families, friends, and regular routines who suddenly vanished without a trace. Many were Indigenous women. Many struggled with addiction. Many were involved in survival sex work. And because of who they were, their disappearances didn't initially receive the attention they deserved. The women who went missing had names, lives, and people who loved them. Serena Abbotsaway was a mother who loved her children deeply. Mona Wilson was known for her kindness and her bright smile. Andrea Hosebury was just 22 years old when she disappeared. Brenda Wolfe was an artist who loved to draw. Georgina Papin was a mother and grandmother from a First Nations community. Marnie Frey was only 24. Each of these women had their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. Many were Indigenous women who had experienced the intergenerational trauma of residential schools, the 60s coup, and ongoing systemic racism. The community knew something was wrong. Sex workers and residents of the downtown East Side were talking about it, warning each other, trying to stay safe. But their concerns weren't being taken seriously by the authorities. Family members began reporting their loved ones missing as early as the 1980s. But the pace accelerated dramatically in the 1990s. Maggie De Vries, sister of missing woman Sarah De Vries, became one of the most vocal advocates. Other families faced enormous barriers when trying to report their loved ones missing. Some were told that their family members was an adult who had the right to disappear if they wanted to. Others were told to wait, that the person would probably turn up. Indigenous families, in particular, faced dismissive attitudes from the police. There was an underlying assumption that these women had simply moved on, gone to another city, or didn't want to be found. By 1988, community advocates were sounding alarm bells. Organizations like WISH documenting the disappearances and demanding action. They created their own missing persons posters and distributed them throughout the neighborhood. The families of missing women formed support groups and pushed for investigations. Police seemed reluctant to treat these disappearances as connected or as high priority cases. The women were often classified as transient, as people who might have simply moved on. In 1998, Vancouver police finally created a missing persons review team to look into the cases. By then, the number of missing women had grown to over 30. The review team began to see patterns. Women were disappearing from the same small geographic area. The police response to these disappearances has been heavily criticized, and rightfully so. There were clear biases at play because many of the missing women were Indigenous. They struggled with addiction or were involved in sex work. Their cases weren't given the same urgency as missing persons from other demographics. These assumptions, based on stereotypes and prejudice, allowed a serial killer to operate for years. Every day that passed without a serious investigation was another day a predator was free to kill again. Robert William Pickton. Robert William Pickton was born in 1949 and grew up on a pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a suburb east of Vancouver. Robert was reportedly bullied at school and struggled academically. As an adult, he never married and had few close relationships outside his family. He and his brother David eventually took over the family farm after their parents' death. The Pickton family farm was a sprawling, chaotic property that would later become the center of one of Canada's largest crime scene investigations. Robert and his brother David ran a farm which had fallen into disrepair over the years. The property were cluttered, unsanitary, and isolated, despite being in the suburban area. The main slaughterhouse was a particularly disturbing structure that would later figure prominently in the investigation. Pickton was known in the downtown Eastside. He would drive his distinctive pickup truck into the neighborhood, often late at night or in the early morning hours. He offered women money, drugs, or rides. Some women who encountered him and survived later reported feeling uncomfortable around him, sensing something was off. Pickton hosted parties at the farm, which provided cover for bringing women to his property. Some attendees later recalled seeing women at these parties who subsequently disappeared. The first significant police contact with Pickton related to these crimes came in 1997, a missed opportunity that would haunt the investigation for years. A woman, whose name has been protected, escaped from the Pickton farm after a terrifying ordeal. She reported that he had attacked her in one of the farm buildings. She had been handcuffed and stabbed multiple times, but managed to break free and flee the property. Her injuries were serious, requiring hospitalization. She was able to provide police with detailed information about her attacker and the location where the assault occurred. Pickton was charged with attempted murder, unlawful confinement, and aggravated assault. This should have been a turning point, but the case fell apart. The charges were eventually stayed in 1998. The woman, who struggled with addiction and had a criminal record related to survival sex work, was deemed an unreliable witness by the Crown prosecutors. If that case had proceeded, if Pickton had been convicted and imprisoned in 1998, how many lives might have been saved? As the missing persons cases piled up through the late 1990s into the early 2000s, police began developing suspects. Pickton's name came up multiple times. Tips from the community pointed toward him. In 1999, police received information that Pickton might be involved in the disappearances. But building a case was difficult. There were no bodies, no crime scenes that could be definitively connected to the disappearances, and limited physical evidence. In early 2002, the investigation finally gained the momentum it needed. Police executed a search warrant at the Pickton farm on February 5th, initially for illegal firearms. What they found there was beyond horrific. The property was a nightmare of evidence. Within hours of beginning their search, officers discovered personal belongings of missing women. Identification, clothing, and jewelry that family members would later recognize as belonging to their loved ones. DNA evidence began to emerge from multiple locations across the property. The farm became the largest crime scene in Canadian history. The discoveries at the farm were gruesome human remains that were found in multiple locations across the property. The pig farm's operation had potentially been used to dispose of bodies, a horrific reality that investigators had to confront. Investigators had to shift through soil, examine buildings, and process an overwhelming amount of potential evidence. The scale of the crime scene was unprecedented in Canadian law enforcement history. Robert Pickton was arrested on February 22, 2002, 17 days after the initial search warrant was executed. Initially charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. The charges grew as evidence mounted and more remains were identified. Eventually, Pickton faced 26 counts of second-degree murder, later upgraded to first-degree murder. The victims whose remains or DNA were identified represented only a portion of the woman who had disappeared from the downtown Eastside during the years Pickton was active. The arrest and growing charges became a national news story. The case exposed uncomfortable truth about Canadian society, about how marginalized women had been failed by the system meant to protect them. For the families of the missing women, the arrest brought a painful confirmation of their worst fears, but also a sense that finally someone was being held accountable. The trial began in January 2007. Nearly 5 years after Pickton's arrest, and it was one of the most complex and lengthy in Canadian history. Due to the number of charges and the complexity of the evidence, the trial was split. Pickton was first tried on 6 counts of second-degree murder, the cases where the evidence was strongest. The prosecution presented DNA evidence linking Pickton to the victims, testimony from the witnesses who had been to the farm, and evidence recovered from the property. The evidence painted a picture of a serial predator who had operated over years, targeting vulnerable women he knew would not be immediately missed. The defense argued that Pickton might have been present when the woman died, but wasn't necessarily the one who killed them, an attempt to create reasonable doubt by suggesting conspiracy theories without providing concrete evidence of other perpetrators. The trial was emotionally devastating for the families of victims. Many families felt the justice system had failed their loved ones twice. First, by not protecting them when they were alive and vulnerable, and then by not charging Pickton with first-degree murder from the start. The trial also raised questions about whether Pickton had accomplices, questions that remain unanswered to this day. But no one else was ever charged. In December 2007, after 11 months of testimony and evidence, Robert Pickton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder. Pickton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence available for second-degree murder. The Crown's decision not to proceed with the remaining 20 murder charges sparked intense debate. Many families felt betrayed by this decision. For them, each charge represented a life, a person who deserved their day in court. The decision reinforced a painful message that had haunted this case from the beginning. The society placed different values on different lives. The Pickton case exposed massive failures in how society and law enforcement treat marginalized women. In 2010, the British Columbia government announced a public inquiry, the Missing Woman Commission of Inquiry, to examine the police investigation and the societal factors that allowed these crimes to continue for so long. The inquiry heard from families, community advocates, sex workers, police officers, and experts. The inquiry revealed systematic discrimination at multiple levels. Police had operated with assumptions about the lifestyle of the missing woman that led them to deprioritize these cases. The inquiry found that opportunities to catch Pickton earlier had been missed, including the 1997 attempted murder charges that were stayed. One of the inquiry's most damning findings was about the fundamental failure to protect the vulnerable woman. The report documented how societal prejudice about Indigenous women, women struggling with addiction, and sex workers had infected the investigation. Police had classified many of the missing women as high risk in their files, a designation that paradoxically seemed to make their cases lower priority than the higher. The inquiry made 63 recommendations for improving how police handle missing person cases, particularly involving marginalized individuals. Implementation of these recommendations has been uneven and frustratingly slow. The case also highlighted the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. A disproportionate number of Pickton's victims were Indigenous. This reflects a broader pattern of violence against Indigenous women across the country that has roots in colonialism, systematic racism, and ongoing marginalization. Indigenous women in Canada faced violence at rates dramatically higher than non-Indigenous women. The Pickton case became a rallying point for activists demanding action on the issue. The Pickton case, because of its scale and media attention it received, brought this issue into mainstream consciousness. This advocacy contributed to the eventual national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which launched in 2016. In 2019, the inquiry released its final report. Crucially, the report called the violence against Indigenous women and girls a genocide. The connection between the Pickton case and the broader MMIWG crisis is undeniable. The same factors that made women vulnerable in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, the same biases that led police to deprioritize their disappearances, these patterns repeat across the country. The downtown Eastside community was traumatized by these crimes. But the fundamental issues of poverty, addiction, and marginalization that made these women vulnerable remain largely unaddressed. The downtown Eastside continues to struggle with inadequate housing, insufficient mental health and addiction services, and poverty. While the Pickton case led to some re-inform of how police handle missing person cases, it hasn't led to the kind of comprehensive social change that would actually make women in communities like downtown Eastside safe. There are still unanswered questions about the Pickton case. Did he have accomplices? The farm hosted parties and had multiple people coming and going. Some evidence suggested others might have been involved in the crimes, or at least knew what was happening. However, no one else was ever charged. Were there more victims than the one identified? Pickton himself allegedly claimed to have killed 49 women, though the statement's reliability is questionable. The official victim count includes only those women whose DNA or remains were definitively found at the farm. For many families, closure may never come. They live with the uncertainty of not knowing for sure what happened to their loved ones. Robert Pickton, in 2010, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld his conviction, rejecting his appeal. The focus should remain on victims, the systematic failures that enabled these crimes, and the work still needed to protect vulnerable women. The legacy of the case is complex and far-reaching. It exposed uncomfortable truths about how society treats marginalized people, particularly Indigenous women and those struggling with addiction and poverty. It showed how prejudice and bias can literally be deadly when those in positions of authority don't take concerns seriously. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry led to the concrete reforms in British Columbia and beyond. However, many advocates argue that not enough has changed. We need to remember the women who were killed. Serena Abbotsway, Mona Wilson, Andrea Hosebury, Brenda Wolfe, Georgina Papin, Marnie Frey, Tiffany Dew, Cara Ellis, Cynthia Felix, Helen Hallmark, Heather Bottomley, Patricia Johnson, Heather Shinnock, Igna Hall, Sarah DeVries, and so many others. These women weren't just statistics or case numbers. They were human beings with hopes, dreams, talents, and people who loved them. This case could serve as a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. When we allow prejudice to determine whose life matters, those disappearance gets investigated. Whose life is a priority, we create the conditions where predators can operate with impunity. The Pickton case is directly connected to a broader crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. The National Inquiry's final report, released in 2019, documented that Indigenous women and girls are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than other women in Canada. Real change requires addressing root cause. We need police forces that are trained to recognize and address their own biases, that take all missing persons cases seriously regardless of the person's background, and the work collaboratively with communities. As we close this episode, I want to emphasize that this isn't just a story about one serial killer. It's about systematic failure, about how society treats people based on their circumstances, about the ongoing crisis of violence against Indigenous women, and about the need for real change. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. In Canada, you can contact at 1-833-456-4566, available 24/7. Thank you for listening to this difficult episode. The story of Robert Pickton and the missing woman of Vancouver is one we must remember, not for its horror, but for the lessons it teaches us about justice, dignity, and our responsibility to protect all members of our community. We remember these women not as victims, but as human beings who deserved better from all of us. Their stories demand that we do better, that we create a society where everyone's safety matters, where everyone's disappearance is investigated with urgency, and where the most vulnerable among us are protected rather than ignored. I am Nazif. This was Haunted Action. I'll be back again with another episode, with another mystery, crime, thriller, or haunted situation and incident. Until next time, take care of each other.